अगर मैं आपसे ये सवाल करूं कि नेम मी सम ग्रेट फिलोसोफर्स, तो उसमें एक फ़र्द का जिक्र ज़रूर आएगा, एंड दैट इज़ सॉक्रेटिस। हर बंदा जो है अगर वो कुछ भी फ़लसफ़े के बारे में जानता है तो वो ये ज़रूर जानता है कि एक वो बड़ा ग्रेट आदमी था, उसका नाम था सॉक्रेटिस। एंड इफ़ यू नो नथिंग एल्स अबाउट सॉक्रेटिस, देन एटलीस्ट यू नो perhaps this, that he was sentenced to death by the Athenian court for the things that he was preaching. और जो उसके खिलाफ इल्ज़ाम लगे थे वो दो थे, एक तो ये that he was preaching against the gods of ancient Greece, and secondly that he was quote unquote corrupting the youth, corrupting young people, for which he was then asked to either leave the city or to drink poison, hemlock, and he chose not to go into exile, not to try and save his life, but instead chose to drink hemlock and kill himself or whatnot. Preferred to embrace martyrdom. He is considered one of the first great martyr in the history of philosophy, a martyr for philosophy. But the interesting thing about Socrates is that he, although is one of the most influential figures in the history of philosophy, very well known to everybody, बच्चा बच्चा उसको जानता है, अरबी में हम उसको सुकरात कहते हैं, उर्दू में भी सुकरात का लफ्ज़ इस्तेमाल किया जाता है. But the interesting thing is, how many books do you think Socrates wrote? Let me ask you this question. Sorry? Zero. That is the correct answer. He never wrote a single book in his life. In fact, he thought that writing is a very poor way to communicate and to think about ideas, and he preferred always to communicate and talk about ideas through speech. He preferred speech. So how then did the world discover Socrates? How does he live on if he never wrote a single book in his life? Yes. Sorry? Well, first and foremost through Plato. Plato, yes. First and foremost through Plato. It was Plato who took the ideas of Socrates and wrote them down. So if we know, whatever we know about Socrates, we know mainly from Plato. We also know a little bit about him from his other student, but mainly the Socrates that we get is the Socrates of Plato. And it's very difficult at times for that very reason to discern what is Socrates himself and what is Plato speaking on behalf of Socrates. So today we are going to talk about Plato. Do you know Plato का उर्दू में नाम क्या है? Yes. अफलातून. और अगर कभी आपकी नानी ने आपको झिड़का हो और आपने आगे से बहुत ज़्यादा ज़बान चलाई हो, जिस तरह मिसेस खान कहती है कि औरतों को नहीं चलानी चाहिए, तो शायद आपकी नानी ने ये फ़िक्रा बोला हो या दादी ने कि तू वड्डा अफलातून आया है मामा. कभी सुना आपने ये फ़िक्रा? सुना है? चलो कुछ लड़कों ने सुना है, शायद और लोगों ने नहीं सुना. बहरहाल इट्स अ वेरी पंजाबी फ़िक्रा that grandmothers used to use at one time. Do you think of yourself as Plato? So that's what we're going to talk about today. This great man who really synthesized many of the ideas that were germinating at the time in ancient Greece. We're going to look at his biography. We're briefly going to see who he was. Then the most important aspect of his philosophy is his theory of knowledge, what's also called the theory of form, or the forms, or the theory of essences, etc. Then we're going to look at the allegory of the cave, and last but certainly not least, in fact most importantly, we're going to come to the Republic, which is his writing on politics. All of his ideas are really, all of his various books are really influenced by his theory of knowledge, and he tries to apply his theory of knowledge, his theory of forms, to various aspects of human affairs in order to come at, in order to show how his theory of knowledge would be translated into the various fields of knowledge. So, Plato was probably born 427 years before Jesus Christ and died 347 years before Jesus. His real name was Aristocles. Thank God people started calling him Plato, because can you imagine agar aap koi confusion ho gayi between Plato and Aristotle, how much confusion there would have been between Aristocles and Aristotle. Itne similar sounding naam hai. So Plato was his sort of lakab keh lein aap usko. And that means broad, because, well, first of all, he was quite broad. He had a broad forehead and so on. He had a broad build, but also because he had broad and very wide knowledge. He was an extremely knowledgeable person, from the natural sciences, mathematics, to philosophy, to everything that people had written in his period. He had read, he had discussed. He was a prolific reader and also a writer. He was a student of Socrates, and he was the teacher of Aristotle. So you see a line here, कि Socrates ने प्लेटो को पढ़ाया, प्लेटो ने एरिस्टोटल को पढ़ाया, एरिस्टोटल ने आगे फिर अलेक्जेंडर को भी पढ़ाया और लोगों को भी पढ़ाया. So you see a line there that's quite interesting. और जहाँ लाइन नहीं भी होती तो ग्रीक्स जो है ना जानबूझ के कोई लाइन लगा देते हैं कि इसका स्टूडेंट वो था, इसका स्टूडेंट वो था, इसका स्टूडेंट वो था. Aristotle and Plato themselves also had a very long, very interesting and very fruitful intellectual relationship. Plato founded the first academy in Athens. He named it after a Greek hero called Academus. And where in that academy he taught, taught philosophy, mathematics, gymnastics, and physics, and everything that he could, really. And so today when we say, please do well in your academics, we are really paying homage, or we say LUMS is an academic institution. We are really paying homage to Plato, who set up the first formal university, you could say, set up the first formal institution where philosophy would be taught. And you can see his influence कि आज तक जो बंदा university set up करता है या college set up करता है या even कोई school set up करता है तो उसका नाम दिया जाता है academics, right? और नाम इसीलिए दिया जाता है because Plato gave it that name, and he gave it that name after a Greek hero, and we still use that name even though we are not aware of the origins of that incredible name. And that just tells you the influence that Plato has had on our thought. In fact, the influence is even greater than that. Alfred North Whitehead, who himself is a really well-known great philosopher, says that the European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Imagine that, कि Plato के बाद जितने लोगों ने लिखा है वो basically they are footnotes. No, not that way, but they are basically just commenting on what Plato wrote, either trying to oppose him or trying to support him, but nobody seems to have managed to write anything that had nothing to do with Plato. That is his influence. Now, we should go back in time to when Plato sort of lived and wrote and thought, and this is a long, long, long time ago. It is, you go back in time, you think of Prophet, peace be upon him, 1400 years ago. It's older than that. You go back even further and you think of Jesus Christ, 2100 years ago. Well, he's even older than that. He's pre-Christian. He is around, as you can see, 400 years older. 4 centuries before Jesus Christ is when Plato came about. That is a really long time ago. That's approximately 2,500 years ago. And the fact that I am still teaching somebody, and everybody's teaching it, whoever's teaching Introduction to Philosophy or Western philosophy is teaching Plato, the fact that we are still teaching somebody who lived not 2,500 years ago, not 250 years ago, but 2,500 years ago is a real testament to his intelligence, to his writing, to his intellect, I think. If we go back in time to Athens, Greece at the time was not what you can call a country in the way that we look at Greece today. Today, Greece is a country on its own. Rather, Greece is quite hilly, and between the hills there are valleys, and in those valleys are cities. And so Greece at the time had various city-states. These states basically centered around the city. They took from the countryside, and they were largely quite independent from each other. They didn't think of themselves as Greeks, for example. They thought of themselves as Athenians. They thought of themselves as Spartans. They thought of themselves as belonging to Corinth or any of the other cities. And these cities often had made alliances with each other against their common enemy, who were, interestingly, also Greeks. So the two great big alliances were Athens on the one hand and Sparta on the other hand. And they fought many long years, which were called really the Peloponnesian Wars, and that is the context in which Socrates and Plato both exist. A little note about these wars. Sparta and Athens had two very different kind of social systems. Athens had a remarkable politician by the name of Pericles, who most of you may not have heard of. But it is Pericles really who is the founder of what we call democracy. It is not Socrates, it is not Plato, and it is not Aristotle or any of the philosophers. In fact, although अगर आप कभी BA लेवल किताब में उठा के देखें या CSS के इम्तिहान में देखें तो अक्सर लोग कहते हैं the Greeks invented philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, invented democracy, Plato and Aristotle spoke about democracy. Well, they did speak about democracy, but what they had to say about democracy was that basically it was a very bad system and that they didn't support it, they were opposed to it. We don't quite know exactly where Socrates stood with respect to the question of democracy, because what we know about Socrates we know mainly from Plato, but we do know very clearly that Plato himself did not think very highly of democracy. But the Athenian state was ostensibly what we call a democratic state. But we have to go back in time to Athens and understand what we mean by ancient Greek democracy. It doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean that everybody had the right to vote. Number one, women did not have the right to vote. No matter which class they belonged to, whether they were rich or poor, whether they had slaves working under them, and they did, but they did not vote in the political system. They did not have the right to vote at all. Number two, non-Greeks and slaves did not have the right to vote. So poor people, people without property, people without slaves, etc., did not have the right to vote. Thirdly, as I've already said, mentioned slaves again and again, this is a society that was built up on slavery. Slavery itself came out of tribal war when tribes fought each other. After a certain point in time, one tribe conquered the other tribe, and instead of eating them up, as would frequently occur, or killing them off, as could frequently occur, or making them run away, etc., as could occur, all of these three outcomes were possible in ancient tribal war. They decided after a certain while that they could really make use of the conquered tribe by setting them to work in agriculture or in their homes, etc. So began a system whereby they could purchase and they could sell people, and this laid the foundation of the city-states of ancient Greece. So really the foundation of civilization, this is one of the oldest civilizations we're talking about. It's not the oldest, but it's certainly one of the oldest. The oldest civilizations. Okay, let me clarify that word as well. By the term civilization, I mean, or historians generally mean, a society that creates a city. A civilized person is not necessarily somebody who knows how to use a fork and knows how to sip a cup of tea, as we think today. He's very civilized. Bada tehzeeb yafta hai, gali galoch nahi karta. What it meant in those days to be civilized was basically to live in a city. To be a shahri meant to be civilized. So it's a very different definition from what we understand today. It has nothing to do with culture. Well, it does have to do with culture, because people who lived in the city then developed an urban city culture. But but it has essentially to do with the form of society and the state. That civilization meant people who are living in cities. So the earliest people who began living in cities are people from Babylon, people from Egypt, people from China, people in the Indus Valley civilization built ancient cities before the Greeks built them. But one of the oldest civilizations nonetheless are the Greeks, Athens and Sparta in particular. The peculiar thing about this civilization is that they loved to write, and they would, whatever they felt, whatever they thought, they would write it down. They of course took the alphabet from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are the ancient people who lived in what is today Palestine, Israel, Syria, and so on, Lebanon. The Phoenicians were a seafaring people, and they would trade often with the Greeks, and they probably took it from the Egyptians, or developed it together with the Egyptians, or the Egyptians took it from them, etc. And then the Greeks discovered it from the Phoenicians and Egyptians and so on, and developed their own alphabet from there. So they loved to write. They wrote everything down, like as I told you, Plato, wrote down what he was saying. So the influence of Greek philosophy has been remarkable because of the writing. I think, the other day you were asking me this question about Kautilya, etc. And I told you that one of the things was that these were largely oral traditions and oral cultures and oral histories, etc. And when these traditions were oral, they had to be memorized by heart, etc., which limited the canvas on which they could spread the ideas. But so the Greeks were writing these things down. Now, one of the very interesting things that comes about is, as I was saying, the two major city-states, the two largest and strongest cities were Athens on the one hand and Sparta on the other. आपने वो फिल्म देखी है, मुझे बहुत ही बुरी लगती है वो फिल्म जिसका नाम है 300। तौबा अस्तगफार, इतनी बुरी फिल्म जो है शायद ही कभी किसी ने बनाई हो। बहरहाल उसके अंदर द ग्रीक्स आर फाइटिंग द Persians, and the Persians have been depicted in the worst possible manner, you know, although they were not like that at all. But this is like a comic book. It's not really a fact. It's not really really historical. So the Athenians, if you remember that movie or the sequel to it, I don't know what the sequel was called, maybe 600 or something. No, that's not the name. But anyway, the point is that the Athenians would wear blue cloaks. They would wear blue cloaks, and the Spartans would wear red cloaks, and the men would wear their hair very long, and you know, prided themselves on being great warriors. Both sides were really warrior civilizations in a certain sense. They had conquered other people, taken them slaves and so on, and prided themselves on their armies. Sparta in particular was a very strong aristocracy. So you had a couple of families that were the ruling families. They ruled the entire city. And the criteria that they set for young men especially was whether or not they could be good fighters, whether or not they could be good warriors. And from a very young age, they would take these children and they would train them in the art of combat. So to that extent, the film correctly depicts Sparta as a society where the cult of the warrior was held in great and very high esteem. Athens, on the other hand, was different from Sparta in the sense that they also had a warrior tradition. In fact, they had such strange traditions in Sparta and Athens कि अगर एक बच्चा जो है वो पैदा हो जाए और वो बच्चा जो है किसी भी हवाले से deformed हो या किसी हवाले से बहुत कमज़ोर हो, तो they would throw the child away. They would throw the little baby outside the city gates, let the animals eat it, etc. So that's the kind of society we are talking about. You know, not a society that said, you're disabled, don't worry, let me build you a ramp. It was the kind of society that was, you know, quite a brutal society in one sense, and a sexist, misogynist society at the same time. But Athens had one peculiar thing that Sparta didn't, and that was a navy. They had a navy, and they needed a navy because obviously, you know, they were seafaring people, etc. And when they built the navy, obviously it takes great labor power to build a navy, to man a navy, and so on. तो नेवी के अंदर जो लोग काम करते थे वो थे ना तो वो गुलाम थे और ना ही वो गुलामों के आका थे. वो बीच में एक तबका था जो कि आज़ाद थे मगर they were not slave owners either. और इस तबके का नाम जो था वो था the demos, the people. Because जो slaves थे ना उनको तो people माना ही नहीं ना जाता था. उनको तो माना जाता था tools with a voice. औजार हैं ये. They are just tools that, you know, like जिस तरह animal होता है तो एनिमल आपकी प्रॉपर्टी होता है, जिस तरह को गाय भैंस वगैरह है वो आपकी प्रॉपर्टी, उसको जिस तरह मर्जी आप इस्तेमाल करें. स्लेव्स का भी यही हिसाब था. सिर्फ फ़र्क जानवरों और स्लेव्स में ये था कि स्लेव्स जो है वो बात भी कर सकते थे, जानवर बात नहीं कर सकते थे. उसके अलावा उनके सोशल स्टेटस में कोई ख़ास फ़र्क नहीं था. यू ओन्ड पीपल एज प्रॉपर्टी. So Navy was a very prestigious thing. They didn't want the slaves working it. The slaves were working in the plantations, etc. They were serving in the homes and so on. So in the Navy, they had they had the demos work. They were Greeks who were not super rich, so they didn't have slaves, and they were not so poor that they were themselves slaves. They were in the middle. Now, since Athens had a navy, and these people were very, very important, ये जो लोग थे वो ये कहते थे कि ठीक है जी, हम आपकी नेवी में काम करेंगे. We will build your ships, we will man your ships. And Athens के लिए वो ships बड़ी important थी. That's how they conquered their neighboring sort of areas. तो we will do all of this work for you, मगर हमें भी कुछ हकूक मिलने चाहिए, हमें भी कुछ rights मिलने चाहिए, हमारी बात भी थोड़ी बहुत माना करें आप, हमारी राय भी लिया करें. So Pericles, the ancient Greek politician, very clever politician, said, yes, that sounds like a very good idea. ऐसा करते हैं, हम एक assembly बनाते हैं, वहाँ सब लोग आएँ जो कि Greeks हैं, जो कि मर्द हैं, और फिर सफ़ेद और काले पत्थर वहाँ पे बड़े आम मिलते थे उधर जहाँ पे वो assembly करते थे, और वहाँ पे सफ़ेद और काले पत्थरों से you could put them into a little basket, and you could vote on policies in that particular way. Now this is only about maybe 10 to 20% of the population. 80% of the population, 50% तो औरतें हैं तो वो तो वैसे excluded हैं. बाकी slaves वगैरह हैं तो वो भी excluded हैं. So this is only about 10 to 20% of the population. And this is a very small state we are talking about, you know, a couple of thousand people. We're not talking about a million people. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking about a couple of thousand people, maybe 10,000 people, maybe 5,000 people at the most. So you can imagine, what is the size of LUMS? How many students are there at LUMS? Tukka lagaye. Exactly, that's very good. There are about 4,000. So LUMS could be its own city-state. And you can imagine, if we were to say, if the Vice Chancellor were to say, औरतें vote नहीं करेंगी, और जो freshmen or sophomores हैं वो vote नहीं करेंगे, but senior and junior men have the right to vote. So then you could probably fit everybody who could vote into the central courtyard and, you know, have an election or whatever. So that's the kind of democracy we are talking about, very limited. But nonetheless, it was nonetheless still quite different from Sparta, which didn't have anything of this sort, where the main families took all the decisions. So the fight between Athens and Sparta, on the one hand, was over, you know, influence over other Greek states and so on and so forth, and over surplus that was being derived from those states and taxes and revenue and so on. But it was also an ideological conflict about two systems, two very different social systems. You can say it was the Cold War of that particular period, but fought out only in one region. Cold War, of course, was fought out globally. This was fought out only there. दो मुख्तलिफ social systems हैं, one based on purely on an aristocracy, the other based on a mixed system of democracy, where the aristocrats take decisions, but then they also put those decisions to vote to the demos. And it's from that word demos that you get the word democracy. Cracy just means rule, rule of the demos. Demos is not everybody, it's basically those people who had no property, etc. So that's what democracy comes from. And the other term that you hear quite frequently is demagogue or demagoguery. So he's such a demagogue, Toba. You know, Bhutto was a demagogue, or Imran Khan is a demagogue, people will often say, right? So demagogue also means, gog means tongue. So demagogue means a person who speaks the tongue of the demos, in other words, who speaks the language or takes the point of view of the demos. ठीक है ना? कि ये तो riffraff का point of view ले रहा है. So the aristocrats used to think of those who were demagogues, representative of the demos, who spoke the tongue or took the point of view or represented the interests of the demos, as being lowly politicians, and hence the term demagogue came to mean someone who was an opportunist sort of politician. Those who represented the aristocracy were those who represented the noble people and were considered good politicians. Today, of course, the word demagogue means something quite different from what it did back then, but I'm just telling you what it meant back then. That's how we get these words in our language today. So this was the big fight, and it went on for many, 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 many years. Socrates, in fact, participated in this fight. Plato was a young man when this fight was going on. Plato was about 20 years old when Socrates was an old man and was, took the pyala, apni mazar da pyala pita, vagara, vagara, and took it very bravely, in fact. And he was in, उस ज़माने में जेल का तस्वर भी बड़ा मुख्तलिफ था आज के ज़माने से. तो when he was drinking the hemlock, his students, etc., were allowed to be with him as he was drinking the hemlock, etc. और वो रो रो के पागल हो रहे थे, हमारा उस्ताद, काश आप भी मेरे से कभी इतना प्यार करते. बहरहाल रो रो के पागल हो रहे थे, हमारे उस्ताद को मार दिया, अब हम फिलोसफी कैसे सीखेंगे. And Socrates like, क्या बोंगिया मार क्या कर रहे हो, रोई जा रहे हो वगैरह वगैरह, और I'm going to another realm, etc. This is pre-Christian, so he didn't believe in heaven or hell in the same way that we think of it, obviously, but he did think of a transcendental world, and he thought that that's where he was sort of going to go, and there was no need to cry and make a fuss about the whole thing. And he was rather quite brave about the way he took it, etc., much of which was written down by his pupils later on, which really inspired them as well. But Plato himself personally was quite distraught at that particular thing, and in a certain sense came to hate the system that had given this punishment to his great ustad, and that system, of course, was democracy. Socrates का जो trial था वो भी आज के trial से बड़ा मुख्तलिफ था, in the sense that he was presented before the assembly which was about approximately 500 people. And so it was much more like a jalsa in which people were accusing Socrates, and Socrates was defending himself, and so on and so forth. It was a really public, big debate, quite interesting. And Socrates lost that debate. And the interesting thing is, once he lost that debate, then there was another debate about what punishment he should be given. And punishments, the lighter punishment was कि दफ़ा हो जाओ फिर हमारे शहर से, कहीं और जाके बस लो. ये शहर बड़ा, मतलब वहाँ पे बड़ी riches थी और बड़ी development वगैरह थी, तो किसी को शहर से निकाल देना बड़ी serious punishment होती थी. इसका मतलब है उसको पेंडू बनना पड़ेगा, पेंड जाके रहना पड़ेगा, धोती पहननी पड़ेगी. को they didn't wear धोती in Greece, but the point is, you get the point. So जब punishment की बारी आई उसी assembly के सामने, तो लोगों ने पूछा अब जब कि आपकी गिल्ट जो है वो you've been declared guilty, तो आपको क्या सज़ा मिलनी चाहिए. तो सोक्रेटिस का बड़ा ज़बरदस्त जवाब था. उसने कहा मेरा ख्याल है कि मुझे हुकूमत की तरफ से वजीफ़ा मिलना चाहिए. You should pay me money because I have given you a very important and good service, which is that I have been your gadfly. I have been asking you the kind of questions that need to be asked in order to awaken the Athenian people to critical thinking, awaken their minds, their intellect, and so on. The audience was so aghast, so shocked by the fact that Socrates गिड़गिड़ा के माफ़ी नहीं मांग रहा था, बल्कि उल्टा बड़ी प्राउडली उसने ये कहा कि मैंने तो आपकी खिदमत की है, मुझे वजीफ़ा मिलना चाहिए. They were so shocked by that statement कि जितने लोगों ने गिल्टी कहा था उससे अब और भी ज़्यादा लोगों ने ये कहा कि इसको तो सज़ाए मौत होनी चाहिए. He really angered the audience even more, and he was really happy to do that because that's the kind of guy he was. He was not a very good-looking person by Greek standards. You may not think that he's that terribly bad looking at all. But by Greek standards, Greeks had this very sort of, how should I put it, exaggerated notion of what it meant to be beautiful. If you look at their statues, you look at their works of art, etc., they are magnificent works of art. In those works of art, the men are always perfect. They have perfect bodies, six pack, muscular, just absolutely perfect. किसी का टेढ़ी नहीं निकला हुआ, किसी की गंज नहीं हो रही, कोई middle age में जो है ना यूं हंच करके नहीं चल रहा. Yes.
So Greek art is supposed to represent what they thought was the idea of perfection, not what was actually.
Precisely. Yes, I was going to come to that. Didn't mean that all Greeks had six packs, right? Many of them were just like normal people. But that's right. In art, they wanted to reflect that which would be the perfection of that particular person. And similarly, the women are all very, very beautiful, very, very erotic, etc., depicted in very, very erotic manners and so on. Both men and women are quite erotic in that sense. So very, very beautiful. So this man, Socrates, is what I love this English की term है. It defines Socrates perfectly. He was a cantankerous old man. What a beautiful word, cantankerous. What does that mean? He was a disagreeable person. He loved to, आप आराम से जा रहे होंगे, you're walking to PDC, you're maybe smoking a cigarette, you're having a nice day, मौसम बड़ा अच्छा है, and along would come Socrates and he would say, hello, क्या नाम है आपका?
Nimra.
Hello Nimra, how are you doing? And Nimra would say, yes, I'm fine, thank you. You're smoking this cigarette? Yes, I am. Is it a good cigarette? Yes, it is. Do you like smoking? Yes, I like smoke. What is it to you? Well, let's talk about smoking. And he would then just involve anybody sitting anywhere in a market, and he would say, I know nothing about smoking. I know nothing about this craft. I know nothing about how to create pottery. I know nothing about whatever it is that you were doing, music, if you were writing, whatever it is that he was doing, sitting in the market or making or selling, he would come and sit with you and he would say, I know nothing about this, which is a lie. Why don't you tell me about it? और बस फिर उस बंदे को फंसा लेता था. वो आप बड़े खुशी खुशी कहते थे निम्रा कि मैं इसको, obviously you don't smoke, you don't look like a smoker at all, but आप बड़े खुशी खुशी just go with the flow. आप बड़े खुशी खुशी कहते थे कि मैं इसको सिखाऊंगी कि how pleasurable it is, or how nice it is to be an artist, or how nice it is to be a musician, not knowing that this guy is just trapping you. he knows everything there is to know about. He probably knows a lot more about music than you do, and now he's going to patkhofy you in a really bad way. कि आप बोलते रहेंगे और फिर थोड़ी देर बाद आपको ऐसी बात कहेंगे और सोक्रेटिस कहेगा मगर पहले जब हमने कॉन्वर्सेशन शुरू की थी उस वक्त तो आपने ये बात कही थी, अब आप उसके उल्ट बात कर रहे हैं, तो क्या आपके कॉल और फेल में नहीं, वो क्या था लफ्ज़ सोहेल वड़ाइच का कि ये आपकी ये क्या खुला तजाद नहीं है? And really that phrase is very Socratic. Khula tazad. Because tazad, contradiction, is really what Socrates wanted to pick out in the arguments of various people. And he was brilliant at it. He was so brilliant at it that 9 times out of 10, the other person would get really angry and say, why aren't you just accepting what I'm saying? Because nobody likes it. Likes to be told that they don't know what they're talking about and that they're contradicting themselves. Nobody likes to be told that. But he really did get people thinking about those fundamental concepts not by saying to them, let me teach you something about what it is that you're doing, but by being the very opposite of it, by sort of getting you to think better about the things that you were already thinking about and showing you the flaws in your own argument, but in a way where he was turning your own words against you. So it's really quite brilliant. So, and we copy that till today. But for that period of time, young people who were intelligent young people were very attracted to this idea, this method of argumentation. And this method of argumentation has a name, and the name was dialectics. You can write that down. It was dialectics. So di means two, lectic means tongue again, or an argument. So dialectics meant two arguments, right? A contradiction, and what was correct, etc. So Plato, what I was doing with Asmir here was just to illustrate, was not to really, harass the poor guy. He probably figured out what it is that I'm trying to do, was to illustrate to you how Socrates would have badgered, harassed, you till the end of the earth, to try and make you question your own assumptions, the assumptions of your own argument. Okay? By turning, I didn't make any proposition, if you note, against Asmir. I didn't say that objective world exists or that it doesn't exist. I just kept using the arguments he was giving against him and making him justify his arguments. So that was Socrates' method. Beyond that, he also thought that but Socrates was what you would perhaps call an absolutist or an objectivist, in the sense that he did not believe. He was a mortal opponent of people who were called Sophists. And you want to write that down. Who were the Sophists? The Sophists were a bunch of professors who used to go around Greece, and they would teach young people, young aristocrats, for a fees. And they would teach them all the different theories that existed. And they had a code of conduct about themselves. They had developed over time a code of conduct. And the code of conduct was, and it came out of their pedagogy as well, out of their teaching. Yes? Sophist. S-O-P-H-I-S-T. So a sophist means lover of wisdom. A sophist also means a wise person. So, और इसी से वो जुड़ा हुआ लफ्ज़ है फिलोसोफिया, उस पर भी अभी आगे हम आते हैं. तो यार, Parisa, can you just check with them कि ये air conditioning is not working? तो भी ये कुछ खोल दो दरवाजे दरूज से. So the Sophists would go around teaching people, and just like Lum's professors have developed a code of conduct. There's like a stalemate between Lum's professors. Taimur Rahman is a Marxist, somebody else is an existentialist, someone else is a liberal or whatever. तो हमारे दरमियान code of conduct क्या है? वो ये है कि तुम भी सही कह रहे हो, मैं भी गलत नहीं. ऐसे ही है ना? Because we're all teaching different theories, and the Sophists would say, we are going to teach you all the different theories that exist, and you can use them however and whenever you need to use them. You think of them as tools, as weapons that you can deploy against your enemies whenever you need to utilize them. And that itself, that pedagogical method became almost a philosophy. It became a philosophy, an idea that there was no absolute truth, that all truths were relative, that all truths were comparable, they depended on time and space and so on, and they depended on the circumstances and the context, etc. And the task of the wise man, the sophist, was essentially to teach you the different tools that are available, and it was up to you to see which tool suited you best in which circumstance. But there was no attempt really to try and get to the truth. But that's the Socratic version of what the sophists stood for. The sophists themselves are also remarkable figures in the history of philosophy. For example, one great quotation from them is, "Man is the measure of all things that exist and all things that do not exist." And that beautiful phrase, I might have gotten it slightly wrong at the end, but man is the measure of all things, essentially meant that whether we look at something good or bad, etc., we are always judging it from the viewpoint of a society, of a time, of a context, and even of a person. We're always looking at things from the perspective of man. We do not have this God's eye objective view of the world. And we shouldn't pretend to have it either. But Socrates thought, what a bunch of baloney. He thought, this is nonsense. ये तो ऐसी बात है कि आप अगर डॉक्टर के पास जाएं और आप कहें डॉक्टर साहब मेरे पेट में बहुत दर्द हो रही है और आप डॉक्टर से पूछें डॉक्टर साहब मुझे पेट में दर्द जो हो रही है उसके लिए बस्कोपैन खानी चाहिए या मुझे फ्लैजल खानी चाहिए और डॉक्टर आपसे कहे कि आपको कौन सी दवाई अच्छी लगती है और आप कहें डॉक्टर साहब मैं आपसे पूछने आई हूँ कि भाई कौन सी दवाई बेहतर है। नहीं, अगर आपको कौन सी दवाई ज़्यादा अच्छी लगती है आप कहें वेल आई हैव बीन यूजिंग बस्कोपैन, मुझे तो वही पसंद है, बस दैट्स द परफेक्ट दवाई फॉर यू। सो सॉक्रेटिस से ये क्या बात है, कल को वो आगे कहे कि मुझे फ्लैजल पसंद है तो फिर वो फ्लैजल दवाई बेहतर हो जाए, कल को वो आगे कहे कि मुझे दोनों नहीं पसंद, मुझे पोलियो ड्रॉप्स पसंद है तो वो पेट के लिए बेहतर हो जाए। तो दिस मेक्स नो सेंस, राइट? जिसको जो चीज़ पसंद है वही उस वक्त के लिए सच बन जाए, ये कैसे हो सकता है? आप कहते हैं कल बाहर जो है वो दिन है, मैं कहता हूँ बाहर जो है वो रात है, दोनों तो नहीं सच हो सकते, ठीक है? एंड दैट रियली कैप्चर्स the beginning of philosophy, that two contradictory ideas could not be true at the same time. Either you could be a sophist, or you could be, either you could believe in solipsism, or you had to believe that the outside world existed and that therefore there was an objective discoverable truth. You couldn't hold both beliefs to be true, which was the line of argumentation that you and I were having. You could believe that it was day outside, or you could believe it was not day, but you could not believe that it was simultaneously day and not day outside. Two contradictory hypotheses could not be true. That really began Socrates. That is the method of Socrates. That's dialectics in a nutshell. And his idea was that if we practice dialectics often enough and we weeded out the contradictions, we would slowly move towards knowledge, towards the truth. It's not that he said we have it or we could have it or how long it would take to have it, but he said he could move towards it. And that was virtuous. When you look for the good life, when you look for something that was good, in order to find and discover what is good, you needed knowledge. To discover what is courage, for example, you needed knowledge. In a very famous dialogue, Socrates is talking to, I think, Laches. उनकी discussion ये हो रही है कि Socrates आके उसे पूछता है कि what is courage? And he says courage is temperance. डट जाना किसी मामले पे, डट जाने को कहते हैं। अच्छा, अगर कोई बेवकूफ़ बात पे कोई बंदा डट जाए तो उसको आप courageous कहेंगे, ठीक है ना? मिसाल के तौर पे कोई बंदा कहे कि नहीं मैंने तो क्या कोई बेवकूफ़ बात सोचो, कोई बेवकूफ़ बात बताओ। मैंने तो डॉक्टर तैमूर रहमान की पॉल फिल क्लास लेनी ही लेनी है। अगर कोई इस पर डट जाए तो आप कहेंगे कि ये बड़ी बेवकूफ़ बात है, ये कोई करेजियस बात नहीं, ये फुलिश बात है, उसने तुम्हें फेल कर देना, ये जो भी। और सम अदर एग्जाम्पल, मैंने तो सिगरेट पीने ही पीने हैं और आप कहें कि आप कहेंगे कि वो बड़ा करेजियस है बंदा जो सिगरेट पी रहा है। नो, यू वुड से इज जस्ट फुलिश, ही इज जस्ट ruining his own health, right? If you're doing something to, maybe that's not a very good example, but if you're doing something to ruin your own health and you insist on it, or you're doing something to ruin yourself and you insist on it, or ruin society and you insist on it, nobody's going to call that courageous. Everybody will say that is foolish. So Socrates turns around and says, therefore, that to know what is courageous, you have to know what is right or wrong. Because when you take a stance for what is right, then people say you are being courageous. If, like Mrs. Khan, you take a stance on the fact that women should not speak up for their rights, then nobody will call that being courageous. People just say you're trying to destroy your social life, and why are you trying to do that, etc. Or maybe Mrs. Khan, you don't agree with my depiction of that, but anyway. The point was If you have knowledge, you will move to virtue. And that also meant कि जो लोग evil करते हैं, जो लोग cheating करते हैं, जो लोग plagiarism करते हैं, जो लोग इम्तिहान के अंदर एग्जामिनेशन में बूटी बना के आते हैं, उस बूटी बनाने की वजह ये नहीं है कि वो बड़े करेजियस हैं, वो बड़े नॉलेजेबल हैं. उसकी वजह ये है कि और जो लोग डाका डालते हैं, अगर कोई रेप करता है, अगर कोई कत्ल करता है, जो भी जराइम है दुनिया के अंदर, वो जराइम जो है इस वजह से हैं कि वो बंदा जो है वो नॉलेजेबल नहीं है. ये तो बड़ी अजीब सी बात है. जो बंदा वो जुर्म कर रहा है वो कहता है मैं तो बड़ा टीटी फंटूश हूँ. जब आप किताब अपनी छुपा के आते हैं अपने बाथरूम के अंदर और कहते हैं सर आई हैव टू गो एंड टेक अ पी, एंड देन यू गो एंड यू लुक अप the answer, and then you come back grinning and smiling, and suddenly you're writing really fast. पहले आपको खबर ही नहीं थी कि क्या लिखना है सर तैमूर रहमान के एग्जाम में. तो आप तो समझते हैं सर को क्या दगा लगाया, क्या उनको सर को जो है ना बेवकूफ़ बनाया, यही समझते हैं ना आप. या आप कहते हैं कि आप अपने दोस्त को भेज देते हैं और अटेंडेंस शीट पास अराउंड हो रही होती है और आपका दोस्त जो है आपके लिए साइन कर देता है, तो आप कहते हैं ओए यार कमाल हो गया, आज तो क्लास भी नहीं अटेंड की, अटेंडेंस भी लग गई, क्या बात है. यही कहते हैं ना आप, खुश होते हैं ना. या जब आप पकड़े जाते हैं, किसी कोई टुल्ला आपको पकड़ता है और आप उसको जो है ना कहते हैं सर मैं तो फलाने फलाने DIG का बेटा हूँ, हालांकि आप उसका नाम भी नहीं जानते, ठीक है ना, उसे कभी ज़िंदगी में मिले भी नहीं होते हैं, कहीं सुन लिया होता है आपने, और आप कहते हैं मैं फलाने DIG का बेटा हूँ, और वो कहता है सर सॉरी गलती हो गई चले जाए, और फिर आप निकलते हैं कहते हैं कितना कमाल किया मैंने वगैरह. यही करते हैं ना. मैं कुछ झूठ बोले हैं. You feel proud when you cheat the system in one way or another, right? You run a light, you say, oh, I got here faster. You switch lanes, traffic, ये वो जो भी है, लाइन तोड़ के आप आगे चले जाते हैं. कितने आप खुश होते हैं, ओह बेवकूफ़ लोग, 15 मिनट से खड़े हुए, मैं तो लाइन तोड़ के आगे आ गई और मैंने अपना वीज़ा करा लिया जल्दी. ऐसे ही होता है ना. मैं गलत कह रहा हूँ? आपका क्या नाम है पर्पल में? जी आप ही नहीं, ये इधर बीच में. यस, हाँ तो ठीक कह रहा हूँ मैं. ऐसे लोग सोचते हैं ऐसे. आप भी कभी कभार ऐसे सोच लेती हैं? देखा ना, एटलीस्ट वी हैव एन ऑनेस्ट पर्सन हियर. सो सोक्रेटिस ये कह रहा है, सोक्रेटिस बड़ी दिलचस्प बात कहता है. सुमिया सोक्रेटिस ये कहता है कि जब आप ये अमल कर रही हैं तो आप सोच ये रही हैं कि आपने तैमूर रहमान को जो है ना बेवकूफ़ बना लिया है, बट एक्चुअली तैमूर रहमान को तो कोई फ़र्क नहीं पड़ा. फ़र्क तो आपको पड़ा है. और आपने एक्चुअली अगर आपके पास आप नॉलेजेबल होती तो आपको अंदाज़ा ये होता कि एक्चुअली आपने अपने आप को नुकसान पहुंचाया. अब सुमिया ये सोचेगी कि ये कैसी अजीब सी बात है, मैंने अपने आप को क्या नुकसान पहुंचाया, मेरा ग्रेड तो बेहतर आया पहले से. एक एग्जांपल आपको देता हूँ. कोई आप में से स्पोर्ट्स खेलता है? कोई तो खेलता होगा. ट्रैक क्या खेलती हैं आप? बैडमिंटन. जब बैडमिंटन का टूर्नामेंट आता है आप प्रैक्टिस करती हैं, और जब आप प्रैक्टिस करती हैं टूर्नामेंट से पहले, तो अगर लेट से आपने पर डे 2 घंटे प्रैक्टिस की है, क्या आप कभी अपने आप को ये कहती हैं कि नहीं मैंने आज 3 घंटे प्रैक्टिस की है, जब आपने 2 घंटे प्रैक्टिस की होती है? ज़रूरत ही नहीं है ये कहने की, ठीक है ना. आपने टूर्नामेंट खेलना है, आपको पता है जितनी ज़्यादा आपकी प्रैक्टिस होगी उतना आप टूर्नामेंट में आगे जाएंगी. यू विल नेवर ट्राई टू चीट योर सेल्फ, यू विल मेक अ वेरी क्लियर फ्रैंक एस्टिमेट कि मैंने इतनी प्रैक्टिस की है, ये रिज़ल्ट मेरा निकला है, मैं इतना भागी हूँ, मैं 1 मील जो है वो इतने मिनट में भाग लेती हूँ. यू वोंट ट्राई एंड चीट योर सेल्फ. Why? Because you're trying to estimate for yourself where you stand with respect to your fitness and your skills, correct? But when it comes to studies, you think that cheating yourself from that own knowledge is beneficial to you. Cheating yourself from knowing that your capacity to understand political philosophy actually stands at this particular level, not at the level that you stated it, is helping you in some way. And when you make a habit out of doing that, what happens as a result of that is that you in fact do not develop the capacity that you were supposed to develop, because you're cheating all the time. You're cheating the system all the time, and you graduate from LUMS with, relatively speaking, a good GPA, but without having done the work to earn that GPA, and without having developed the skill set that would have come with that work. You understand? So if you were treating LUMS the same way as you treat your badminton, if you were treating LUMS the same way as you treat your own hobbies, the things you are fond of, writing or literature or art or photography, some people said the other day, or watching Netflix, there's no reason to cheat yourself out of things that you love, correct? Because you want a frank and very honest estimate about yourself there. You are very honest with yourself, and that honesty pays off. because it allows you to develop yourself. But in these matters, you don't want to be honest with yourself. And so you think कि मुझे फ़र्क पड़ता है. In fact, मुझे तो कोई फ़र्क नहीं पड़ता. क्या मेरी तनख्वाह कम हो जाती है? नहीं. क्या मैं नौकरी से फायर हो जाता हूँ? नहीं. क्या मुझे डिस्ट्रिक्ट कमेटी कह रहा हूँ, डिसिप्लिनरी कमेटी बुलाती है कि तुम्हारे क्लासरूम में एक बच्चे ने चीटिंग की थी? नहीं. आई एम नॉट पुट इन द डॉग फॉर एनीथिंग. मैं घर जाता हूँ, मैं अपनी बीवी के साथ बैठ के खाना शाना खाता हूँ, फिल्में हम देखते हैं वगैरह वगैरह, बच्चों के साथ टाइम स्पेंड करते हैं, एंजॉय करते हैं, वापस आ जाते हैं. कोई ढेले का फ़र्क नहीं मुझे पड़ता. फ़र्क आपको ही पड़ता है. बट द फैक्ट दैट यू डू नॉट हैव नॉलेज अबाउट, you don't have knowledge of what it is that you're doing to yourself. If you had knowledge कि ये जो मेरा action है ये मुझे hurt कर रहा है, then you would never do it. So it is your lack of knowledge which makes you do bad things. In the same way, ट्रैफिक के हम असूल तोड़ते रहते हैं, फिर दिन रात हम उसी ट्रैफिक को गालियाँ निकालते हैं कि ये क्या घटिया किस्म की ट्रैफिक है, किसी को गाड़ी नहीं चलानी आती. ऐसे ही करते हैं ना आप. कितना गुस्सा चढ़ता है जब आप गाड़ी चलाते हैं सड़क पे और कोई पीछे आके जोर से हॉर्न मारता है और कहते हैं यार अकल करो, आगे सामने गाड़ियां, मैं किधर जा सकता हूँ. गुस्सा चढ़ता है ना. तो मगर आप एहसास नहीं करते, आप गुस्सा चढ़ता है, आप अगले वाले आगे जाते हैं, उसी तरह किसी और को हॉर्न मारते हैं, एंड द नेगेटिव साइकिल गोज ऑन एंड ऑन. करेक्ट. आपको गुस्सा चढ़ता है जब ट्रैफिक अनसेफ होती है, यू बिकम अनसेफ. But you neglect to mention the fact that you yourself are contributing to making traffic unsafe when you break the law, when you break the traffic light, when you go out of your lane, and so on and so forth. But you never recognize that, do you? You always think that you are benefiting from it, but you are unable to see, if you had knowledge of the fact, that your individual actions are actually causing you greater loss than you realize. वो एक एग्जाम्पल देता हूँ. दोनों तरफ से ट्रैफिक चल रही है, चौका ब्लॉक ट्रैफिक है, बम्पर टू बम्पर गाड़ी लगी हुई है. एक बंदा निकलेगा, वो कहेगा मैं तो इन सबको जो है ना सीधा करता हूँ और मैं इन सबसे आगे निकलूंगा. वो क्या करेगा, अपनी लेन से करके गाड़ी निकालेगा, दूसरी लेन में जाएगा करके आगे जाएगा जहाँ पे लेन थोड़ी सी खाली है, मगर आगे क्या उसको मिलेगी, ट्रैफिक. ठक करके वहाँ उसकी गाड़ी, और 4-5 बंदे देखेंगे कि उसने ट्रैफिक लेन जंप की है, वो भी उसके पीछे गाड़ी लगा देंगे. सून क्या होगा कि दोनों लेन्स के ऊपर बम्पर टू बम्पर सामने सामने ट्रैफिक जैम होगी और 4 घंटे वहाँ गाड़ियाँ खड़ी रहेंगी, इंक्लूडिंग द गाय जो सोच रहा था कि मैं जल्दी निकल जाऊँगा. ऐसे देखा आपने कभी ट्रैफिक में होते हैं? हर वक्त ऐसे ही होता है. सो यू योरसेल्फ कंट्रीब्यूट टू योर डैमेजिंग योरसेल्फ. जी. Malicious intent is not denied, but it is the consequence of a lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge about what is good for you and good for society. So for example, I may intend to hurt you, correct? But I intend to hurt you because I feel it's good for me, correct? Obviously, why else would I intend to hurt you? I would only intend to steal your, let's say, your phone because I want it, right? And I think that's beneficial to me because I'll have your phone at the end of the day and you'll be beat up and so on and so forth, lying somewhere in a pool of blood, right? So I think that's very beneficial to me. But it's the intent to hurt you is a consequence of my lack of knowledge. Because if I had knowledge about the fact that if I make the world unsafe that way, tomorrow I'll be the one who will be victimized, or my family or my loved ones can equally be the victim of a similar street crime. That's absolutely right. For Socrates, that is absolutely correct. If you had knowledge about what was good for you, and there can be another basis, by the way, why Socrates would think that hurting you and taking your phone would be bad for me. The other basis, of course, would be the belief that the phone would make me happy. Socrates would say that's a false belief. That is something that you believe is the case. In fact, that phone will never make you happy. Your unhappiness stems from some other fundamental basis. An object cannot make you happy. You think it can, but it can't. और कल को फिर आप किसी और का फ़ोन छीनेंगे, फिर किसी और का गाड़ी छीनेंगे, फिर जो और करेंगे, thinking that you can fill that void and it will never be filled. Because actually you're not addressing the real problem that exists, which is that you need to go and get a job or something, I don't know, whatever it is, right? So Socrates would say, not just indirectly, कि it's going to, what goes around comes around वाली argument, but even directly, the act whereby I take something that belongs to you and I take it is also extremely damaging for my self-esteem in a real way. I must be quite unworthy that I was unable to do the things that allowed you to earn that phone, right? So what message am I sending to my own psychology Socrates would argue. I'm sending the message that I couldn't have earned it. I had to get it by false means. I didn't have the capacity to earn it. What? What is it? I didn't have the intelligence to earn it. I couldn't work hard enough to earn it. What was the reason that you had to steal it? Right? So stealing can be very damaging for the self-esteem of a person. So then you have to build up this false self-esteem. You have to, build up because, sense of self has been lost. So you build up this false sense of self-esteem, which is why sometimes you see people who engage in street crime who talk in an incredibly exaggerated way about themselves. They're overcompensating for the fact that actually they don't necessarily have a very high value about themselves and about the work they do. Interesting? Yes?
Is it same as Kant's categorical imperative?
Brilliant question. Yes and no. To the extent that Kant and Socrates do both believe that there is something that is the right thing to do, and there is a basis from which we can adduce it and understand it. But the basis in both instances is somewhat different. For Kant, it is really that an action that the world could adopt, whether if that would make the world a better and safer place, would be a just action, etc., is really the continuity of the Christian idea of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Really, that's, in my opinion, that's really where Kant derives the categorical imperative from. It's the secular form of the Christian code, and also, sort of Muslim or religious, whatever, code of conduct. कि लोगों के साथ ऐसे पेश आओ कि जैसे आप चाहेंगे वो आपके साथ पेश आए, ठीक है ना? So that's where he's really deriving it from, in my view. For Socrates, so it doesn't require great knowledge to do that. But for Socrates, however, it's knowledge that gives you that, deep knowledge of not just of what is good for you immediately, but even deeper, Plato would argue, the knowledge of the relationship between ideas and thought and so on, which I'm going to come to in just a little bit. Any other questions before I proceed? थक तो नहीं गए? मज़ा आ रहा है? ना थके हो ना मज़ा आ रहा है. This is a contradiction, as Socrates would say. या तो मज़ा आ रहा है, in which case आप थके नहीं हो, या थक गए हो, in which case मज़ा नहीं आ रहा. Should we maybe stand up so our blood circulation sort of maybe wave our hands, क्योंकि 1 घंटा हो गया आप मेरी बातचीत सुने. ज़रा खड़े हो जाएं 1 second please. तो थोड़ी सी blood circulation हो जाए ना. ये बात. That's the right spirit. Stretch out your arms. Scratch your head. मैं चाह रहा था कि ब्रेक ना हो क्योंकि I'm on the third slide out of 22. All right, sit down. Thank you. इसीलिए मैं आपको stretching के मौका दे रहा था so that we can continue. All right, so virtue is knowledge. So Plato, now there are 2 very interesting theories that exist at the time of Plato. There's Parmenides and Heraclitus, the 2 great babas that exist. Parmenides is considered the father of metaphysics, Heraclitus the father of dialectics. And let's look at what they have to say. But before I do that, I mentioned earlier that the great works of Plato are basically his application of the theory of knowledge to various fields of ideas. So the Symposia and the Phaedrus are applying the theory of ideas to the sphere of metaphysics of love, and so on, and Timaeus and Phaedo and Republic is to politics, etc. Just wanted to quickly go over that. So who is Heraclitus? Heraclitus is a philosopher who famously said, no man can step into the same river twice, because it is not the same river and it will not be the same man. So once I step into a river and take my foot out, and when I step back into the river, I'm not stepping into the same river. What do we mean by that? That's a crazy idea. It is the same river. अगर मैंने रावी में डुबकी लगाई है, फिर मैं बाहर आके दोबारा से रावी में डुबकी लगाता हूँ, तो ऐसे तो नहीं कि रावी जो है वो झेलम बन गया. So what does he mean? What he means is that the specific waters जहाँ पे मैंने कदम रखा था, वो तो अब आगे चले गए. और जब मैं दोबारा से कदम रखा तो वो पानी तो तब्दील हो गया. अब नया पानी आ गया. और दूसरी बात ये कि जिस तैमूर ने उस वक्त कदम लिया था, उससे तो अब मैं बड़ा हो गया हूँ. Cells in my bodies have died, etc. I've aged a little bit. I've had a few new experiences. So the Taimur who jumped into the water at time 2 is different from the Temur who jumped into the water at time 1. I have changed. So everything, in this very simple way, he tries to show you that everything in the universe is constantly in motion, constantly moving. There is nothing in the world physical which is standing still. Everything is coming into being, is being born, wo zinda ho rahi hai, wo ubar rahi hai, and then is collapsing and being destroyed. Things are coming together and becoming organized, and then things are falling apart and becoming disorganized. So the world is in flux. And in a world of flux, it is therefore difficult to have absolute knowledge. Let's say, for example, that I say it is daytime. If I say it is daytime, that will be true for now, but soon it will be nighttime. And that proposition, which was true at time 1, will become false at time 2. Any proposition, therefore, which is not time-bound in some way or the other, is going to be false. And time is the great destroyer. Time is worse than Thanos. Okay, Thanos only destroyed half the living things in the universe. Time will destroy everything that exists in the universe. The planet, the stars, everything. Yes, sad to tell you that a couple of billion years from now, even your sun will no longer exist. And maybe, I don't know, a million, billion years from now, the earth will no longer exist. Mankind may have to find another home, etc. So nothing stands before time. No one stands before time. No great mountain stands before time. Even planet does not stand before time. So we cannot have, how can we have true knowledge when there is nothing steady in the world, when there's nothing static in the world? Whatever you say about the world today will be untrue tomorrow. So you can't have any knowledge which is true as a whole forever, absolute. Secondly, what we can have, therefore, if we don't have truth, is basically we can have only opinions. We can only have true knowledge about things that are fixed, and since things are not fixed, we can't really have true and absolute knowledge. Plato agreed that definitions cannot relate to perceptibles since they are always changing. Perceptibles here is a very interesting term. Perceptibles means things that we perceive with our senses. Everything that we see in the world is perceived by us. Everything that we perceive in the world is always changing. And therefore, we can really have no knowledge of it. On the other hand came this other Baba called Parmenides, who said that reason dictates that change itself is impossible. And he comes up with a really fantastic argument about change. He says, for example, that change occurs when that which is becomes that which it is not. Something becomes that which it is not. So, for example, there was no Temur, and then boom, suddenly in 1975, there was a Temur. So that which was nothing becomes something. And then there is a Temur, and at some future point in time, hopefully not too close, there will not be any more a Temur in this world. Not this one at least, right? And so that which existed will no longer exist. But logically, he says that is absurd. That is absurd because the only thing you can say about that which does not exist is that it does not exist. You cannot conceive of anything that does not exist. For example, if I tell you, Nimra, to think of nothing, can you do it? Imagine nothing in your mind. Can you do it? No, you can't. You can't. What you can do is maybe you'll imagine some black space or something. You look at something black and you say that's nothing. But that's not nothing, that's black. Correct? So in this way, the thing that we can say about nothing, the thing that we can say about nothing is really nothing. We can say nothing about nothing. Because nothing can have no characteristics. It can have no, you cannot say anything about it because nothing cannot have a color, it cannot have a size, it cannot have anything. It can have no characteristics. And since nothing can have no characteristics, he says, and we cannot imagine something without characteristics, the only thing we can say about nothing is that nothing cannot exist. The only thing that exists is something. Something, therefore, cannot become nothing. That which does not exist, nothing, cannot become something. And hence, whatever exists has existed since eternity. And perhaps, what we see are changes in what exists, changes in its form. Certainly, that seems to be an appearance. But whatever exists must have existed from infinity and will continue to exist from infinity, even when it is perceived by us as undergoing change. But that is nothing but an illusion. In a certain sense, what he's saying is the law of conservation of mass and energy. Things have existed, things that exist, they change form, and that's merely a change in appearance. Temur Rahman no longer ceases to exist, but the atoms that made up Temur Rahman have not withered away or died. They're in the soil. They're somewhere or the other. They've been eaten by worms, etc. So Temur Rahman continues to exist, but he exists in maybe a couple of thousand worms now. So what we can logically say is, it's a convoluted argument, है ना? अजीब सी बात की है. Don't worry if you don't get it, because nobody got it. And Parmenides, everybody was scratching their heads and saying, what is he talking about? And it took me a long time even just to be able to say it the way I'm saying it. You know, what doesn't exist, the only thing we can say about that which doesn't exist is that it doesn't exist. If we're saying that it doesn't exist, then whatever exists is the only thing that actually exists, which is logical, correct? So if the only thing that exists is existence, and there is no such thing as that which does not exist, then therefore change, which by definition, by logic, implies that those things that exist will cease to exist, and those things that do not exist will come into existence, implies that something will transform into nothing. But the only thing we said about nothing is that nothing is something that cannot exist. Therefore, something cannot transform into something that cannot exist. Nothing cannot become something, and something cannot become nothing. Hence, what exists continues to exist, and what doesn't exist does not simply exist. Yes?
Is this an early rebuttal to creation?
No.
Why not?
The reason it's not an early rebuttal to creationism is because it takes the New Testament to flesh out creationism in the way that we understand it.
Can we consider, I'm not saying that this is a direct rebuttal, but it can be considered as an argument.
But the second point I wanted to make was, that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make was, we're talking about Greece, where their religion is, the Greek people are not familiar with the argument of creationism. They don't, I mean, the Jews are, at that time, the only people who sort of, in very embryonic form, have that argument. And they exist in Egypt and in Palestine, etc. And their influence on Greece is minimal. And in fact, so the Greek religion as a whole and the Greek culture as a whole did not embrace creationism, nor was it fighting against creationism at that time. It wasn't even a question that arose at the time. We can now take it and say something about creationism, but that wasn't what Parmenides was intending at all. By and large, Greek culture accepted, as not just the philosophers, but Greek culture as a whole, even those who were opposed to the philosophers, were of the view that the universe has always existed and will always exist. And the philosophers gave that a more sort of, how should I put it, a more rigorous deductive argument in the form of Parmenides and many others. So I think it was much more of them sort of suggesting, affirming what their culture already accepted, rather than denying what another culture was sort of arguing at the time. But you can take it in another direction if you like. So Plato liked both Heraclitus and he also liked Parmenides. He thought Heraclitus Baba bhi theek keh raha hai aur Parmenides bhi galat nahi keh raha. You know, he's being a bit of a diplomat. Aap bhi theek hai, main bhi galat nahi type wali baat. And he wanted to synthesize both of them. And the way he synthesized them is absolutely fascinating. He said, we have before us the problem of universals. What is that problem? The problem is that we have many, many different concrete things that exist in the world. For example, there are many, many individuals here whom we would classify as boys or men. Am I right? And there are many, many people here, individuals here, whom we would classify as girls or women. Am I right? How did we arrive at this classification, given that every single one of the men or women that we see is different from each other? There are no two identical men in this classroom. There are no two identical women in this classroom. Then how did we come up with a category man or men when there are no two exactly similar men, there are no two exactly similar apples, there are no two exactly similar dogs, there are no two exactly similar horses, there are no two exactly similar anythings. in the world. Even those things that appear to be very similar are somewhat dissimilar. Even two twins, kisi ka ek yahan til hoga nahi la. Like I had two friends, one was Sarah and the other was Tara. And when I first got to know them, they looked so similar to me that I could never tell them apart. Except Tara had a til over here, and I said, T for Tara, T for til. If I see a til, that's Tara. So that's how I recognized them for years. And no two twins are exactly 100% the same, correct? So how do we come up with this category? Asks Plato. Do you want to answer that question? Anyone? Give it a shot. How do we come up with the category of apple? How do we come up with the category of man, woman, human being, dog, cattle, fish, educated, civilized, physics, chemistry, math? Every single word that you utter is a universal. It includes several categories within it. It's a generalization of some sort, right? Every single word that you utter. Even the word. There are lots of words that come under the category of, there are lots of things, concepts that come under the category of words. The category is itself an abstraction. How do we come up with these abstractions? It's a good, interesting question, isn't it? कोई दो दरख्त एक जैसे नहीं है, फिर भी आप कहते हैं ये नीम का दरख्त है. कोई दो नीम के दरख्त एक जैसे नहीं. आपको कैसे पता चलता है ये नीम का दरख्त है?
You have some basic similarities.
Yes.
जैसे कि उनके पत्तों की शेप अगर नीम के दरख्त है तो उसके पत्तों की शेप एक जैसी हो.
Yes. Yes.
इस तरह हम categorize करते हैं.
वेरी ट्रू, वेरी ट्रू. हम करते हैं इस तरह कैटेगराइज. मेरी बेटियां जो है ना, वो उनके पास वेरियस छोटे छोटे खिलौने हैं ना, तो द एनिमल्स एंड स्टफ लाइक दैट. तो अगर मैं कोई एनिमल पकड़ूँ ना और मैं कहूँ कि वो जा रहा है, तो देखो ये शेर आ रहा है या जो भी, तो they'll immediately respond by saying, no babu, it's not a boy, it's a girl. And I'm like, how do you know it's a girl? Thinking in my mind, dude, it's a share, it's a child's animal, it's not, sexualized in that sense. How do you know it's a girl? I said, sir, see, they said, babu, look, it has eyelashes. I never even noticed that. So they have come up with this category that every doll or animal that has eyelashes is basically a girl, and a doll without eyelashes is a boy. I mean, I didn't teach them that, that's just them. Which just puts my brother in a very odd situation because he has massive eyelashes, always has that massive eyelashes. So how do we do it? Yes, you're right. We look at certain characteristics that are in common. But Plato takes this a step further. Because how do we know, how do we differentiate that these characteristics, 1, 2, 3, are in common, and these characteristics, 4, 5, 6, are differential, but I will ignore them and I will accept. There are maybe 100 characteristics or 1,000 characteristics that everything has, right? 100,000, I don't know, whatever. Yet we pick out 5, 6, 10, 12 characteristics and we say this is what makes a man, this is what makes a woman. How do we pick out those characteristics and say this is what makes a man, this is what makes a woman? This is a very important question, and we continue to ask this question in gender theory and so on and so forth. How do we come up with these categories? How did we come up with these categories? So Plato has his own answer. He says, well, we came up with these categories because if you take just these categories, you will come up with, you can create something with only those categories, and that will be a man. And you can come up with certain, that's terrible, but you can abstract certain categories and that will be a dog. If you make something which is just composed of the categories that make a man and the categories that make a dog, a woman, a child, or whatnot, you take from that only the essential, write that down, essential categories that make up a man. Those things that are essential to the category that we are discussing. And that is what he calls, these essential categories is what he calls essence. The essence of a man, or the essence of a dog, or the essence of a tree are the essential characteristics of that particular category. Okay? And where are these essential characteristics? Do they exist anywhere in the world? Do you see a woman who is not someone, who's just a generic woman? Does a generic man exist? Have you ever met a generic man? He's not Temur. He's not, what was your name? Sorry? Tasmir. He is not, aapka kya naam tha? Faizan. He's just a man. Have you met someone like that? No, you have not. Have you ever met the essential neem ka darakht? No, you have not. Have you ever met the essential triangle? No, you have not. You have met specific triangles that are perfect or imperfect, but you've never met the perfect triangle. Why? Because that essential perfect thing exists only in pure thought. Exists only in pure thought. It's a thought category. It does not exist in the material world as such, but the material world is made on those categories, on those essential categories, but those essential categories themselves exist in the realm of thought. They don't exist in the realm of the material world. And this realm of thought, this Plato thought, that this realm of thought on which real subjects are, reality is based. This realm of thought is a Parmenidean realm. It does not change. The essential characteristics that define a man or a woman or a neem ka darakht or a dog or a cat do not change, even while real dogs, real cats, men, women, countries, cities, whatever, continue to constantly be in change. So the world of reality is a Heraclitean world, and the world of thought is a Parmenidean world. This is a finite world, a world in which time has an impact. This is an infinite world, a world that does not change, that contains the essential concepts upon which the reality is based. How do we have access to this realm of thought? Plato thought that before our soul came to embody our bodies, it existed in this ideal transcendental realm where it was in contact with all the different essential forms that existed on which the world is based. And so when in this world the soul, the mind, sees many different women, it recognizes what it knew in the world, in this transcendental world of forms, the ideal form of a woman, and says, that's a woman, that's a man, that's a child, that's a neem ka darakht, that's a dog, and that's a horse. It's able to make those categories. So in this way, Heraclitus and Parmenides are synthesized, and the problem of the universals is also solved. And also we get a firm foundation for the Socratic universal truths that we were searching for. Socrates, as you remember, was opposed to the Sophists and was saying that there are universal. There is such a thing as the truth, and we have to find it. So in this regard, Plato thought that each category flows into another category or is embraced by another larger category. So the category of man and woman is embraced by the category of human being. Human being includes both. The category of human being is embraced by the category of mammals. Human being is one form of mammal. The category of mammals is embraced by the category of animals. The category of animals is embraced by the category of living things. The category of living things is embraced by the category of things, and so on and so forth. You keep moving up. And as you move up in a pyramid-like structure, you go all the way to the top to one category. And that one category is what Plato calls the good. What does he call it? The good. The perfect one. The perfect category from which everything flows out. And now there are not an infinite number of these categories. There are a limited number of these categories. And right at the pinnacle over here is a one. The one. Good. You can see how easy it is right there for someone to say that the one and the good from which all categories emanate is God. That's all you have to do with Plato in order to arrive at Neoplatonism and much of Sufi thought and much of mysticism and much of religious philosophy. And that, of course, did happen later much after Plato with Neoplatonism. So the purpose of philosophy is dialectically to discover this. It's difficult, but it can be discovered. But once you discover this, you discover the entire pyramid. You discover, what lies behind the material essences you discover the essences and the one essence that is the foundation of all the essences. And once you discover that, you have arrived at knowledge. And once you've arrived at knowledge, then everything will make sense to you. It's almost like, do you remember, how many of you have seen The Matrix? मेरी बड़ी favorite movie है. इतने कम लोगों ने देखी है. Now you're really making me feel old. आपका काम ये है कि आपने जाके Matrix देख के आनी है, ठीक है? At one point in time in The Matrix, Neo, who's fighting in the Matrix, he's inside a computer program, he's fighting in the Matrix, he's doing his kung fu in the Matrix, is suddenly able to decode the entire program. And then all his opponents no longer appear to him as individuals and people, they appear to him only as numbers. And once he decodes it, tuck, 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 he fights them and defeats them without any difficulty. Lovely. That's like what Plato is saying. Once you discover the good, once you discover the essential ideas that is the basis of reality, reality will lay itself out to you in a very simple and easy to understand manner, and you'll be able to make sense of everything in the world.
The last slide was about Socrates and universal truth.
Yes, so Socrates was of the view that there have to be universal truths, and Plato is saying yes, there are. So you could have the form, for example, you have this idea of a red ball. So now it is participating in two kinds of different forms. First of all, it's participating in the form of a ball, which is its own form, and then it is participating in the form of what's called red. Right? So a red ball is participating in two different forms, putting them together. The red participates in color, color participates in blah, 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 ball participates in shapes, etc., etc. All of them move up to one thing, the good, the perfect, beauty, perfection. And from that flows the perfect red. From that flows the imperfect red ball. Okay, so moving on. So reason, he thought, is like math. The good is identified, as you saw, with the one. And I also gave you the example of, this matrix sort of example, that everything sort of comes to you like this abstraction. Mathematics itself is an abstraction. So Plato introduces one of the most important themes in Western philosophy, the theme of dualism. There is a world of ideas in which the perfect unchanging form exists of everything we observe. Before birth, our soul existed in a world of ideas. In this world of ideas, we had direct knowledge of the forms. When we see objects with our senses, our soul is reminded of the ideal forms. Knowledge, therefore, is recollection. The philosophical soul yearns to return to the world of ideas because the world of ideas is infinitely more beautiful. We love that world. We miss it. Knowledge is not gained through observation of the material world, but through the dialectical exploration of the world of ideas. This dualism between perception and reality. Reality are these essential forms behind the concretely existing reality. That's what we have to discover. Now he puts all of this into a very simple story for all of you people to understand. He says कि एक गार है, उस गार के अंदर लोगों को बांध के रखा हुआ है इस तरह करके, और उनको ये भी नहीं इजाज़त कि उनको ऐसे बांधा हुआ है कि वो अपना मुंह भी नहीं पीछे कर सकते, पीछे नहीं देख सकते, सिर्फ सीधा देख सकते, और उनके पीछे एक आग है, और आग के सामने एक बंदा जो है ना वो चीज़ों को यूं यूं करके हिला रहा है, और जो चीज़ें वो हिला रहा है उनका साया दीवार पे पड़ रहा है, और आप क्या देख रहे हैं? साए को देख रहे हैं। आप यूं बंधे हुए हैं और साए को देख रहे हैं जो आपके दीवार के सामने। पीछे देयर इज अ पपेट मास्टर, शैडोज, ही इज शोइंग शैडोज, ही इज डूइंग शैडो पपेटियरिंग इन फ्रंट ऑफ यू। फिर आप में से एक बंदा जो है ना उठता है और अपनी रस्सियां तोड़ लेता है, और वो कहता है मैं बाहर जा रहा हूँ केव से, और मौला जट की तरह जब वो केव से बाहर निकलता है, उसको सूरज की रोशनी जब उसको टच करती है और वो सूरज की रोशनी में पूरी दुनिया को देखता है, तो उसको रियल कलर्स नज़र आते हैं फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम, और दुनिया की रियल ब्यूटी। अब ऑब्वियसली एक शैडो को देखना और रियल चीज़ों को सूरज की रोशनी में देखने में बड़ा फ़र्क है, और जब वो देखता है तो वो तो बिल्कुल महजूज हो जाता है, पागल हो जाता है, कहता है यार क्या ज़बरदस्त बात है। वो भागा भागा वापस अंदर जाता है और अपने दोस्तों से कहता है कि ये तो हम इधर पुतले बैठे हुए हैं, हमें तो रियलिटी का पता ही नहीं, इस गार से बाहर आने की ज़रूरत है। मगर जो उसके साथ उसके दोस्त यार होते हैं, वो बजाय इसके कि कहेंगे चलो ठीक है मेरी रस्सियाँ खोलो हम भी बाहर चलते हैं, वो कहते हैं तुम पागल हो गए, तुम क्रेजी हो गए, और वो उसको कत्ल कर देते हैं। मार देते हैं उसको, कत्ल कर देते हैं। तो इसमें प्लेटो ने अपने नुक्ता नज़र से सुकरात की पूरी कहानी बता दी कि सुकरात वो था कि जिसने अपनी मेंटल जंजीरें तोड़ के उस दुनिया को समझने की कोशिश की जो कि इस मादी दुनिया के पसे पर्दा है और जो कि इस मादी दुनिया की बुनियाद है, जिस बुनियाद पर यह मादी दुनिया जो है वो एग्जिस्ट कर रही है, चल रही है, उसको समझने की कोशिश सुकरात ने की। और जब उसने लोगों को समझाने की कोशिश की कि ये मादी दुनिया की ऑर्डर जो है, उसका लॉजिक जो है किस तरह है, किधर है, क्यों है, कैसे है, तो लोग उससे इतने खफा हुए, इतने खाइफ हुए कि उसी को कत्ल। Dialectics is the science of ideas. It is the correct joining and disjoining of ideas, the knowledge of the relation of ideas to each other. So we have to figure out what is the relationship of red to color, what is the relationship of color to something else, and so on and so forth. It's a broader category. The attainment of this knowledge is the chief problem of philosophy. Now, so that requires that we know these ideas separately, first of all. That's inductive reasoning. To know each idea in relation to other ideas, that is classification and division through deductive reasoning. Classification means कि कौन से ideas जो हैं वो एक बड़े idea के अंदर आते हैं, और division means कि कौन से अलहदा हैं. And finally, moving from classification and division upwards towards the supreme idea, which is the good, the perfection of all ideas. I think this is self-evident. आगे चलते हैं. Now he wants to apply it as you asked. आपका नाम? Faiz asked, how is this applicable to politics? And I thought I was taking a Pol Sci course, और आपने इतना फ़लसफ़ा पढ़ा दिया है, 1.5 घंटे से आप फ़लसफ़ा पढ़ा रहे हैं, कुछ सियासत भी पढ़ा दें. अब सियासत समझना आपके लिए मुश्किल नहीं होगा, प्लेटो की सियासत को समझना आपके लिए मुश्किल नहीं होगा. जैसे कि एक आइडियल वुमन है, by ideal woman I don't mean ideal for me or whatever, I mean ideal in the sense of the essence of a woman. Ideal man है, ideal horse है, ideal form of a cat, dog, whatever है. इसी तरह there is in existence somewhere the ideal form of a state, and that is what he refers to as the republic. That's the ideal state. We have to understand what that ideal is. We don't forget about the real world, forget about Imran Khan, forget about Naya Pakistan. Pehle start with the ideal. What would an ideal country look like? What would an ideal state look like? Not Pakistan. What would Pakistan look like ideally? What would an ideal state look like? Just in the abstract. Then we will know how to get there. So that's what we have to create. First, the end goal is what we have to discover. So Plato says politics must accord with human nature. When you look at human nature, you see that there are 3 different sides of human nature. There's one side which is like the child, which just wants and desires. Correct? And there's the other side which is, that's like your body, your appetites. Then there's the other side which is the spirited element, the good. It needs no touch, it obeys the voice of reason. And he says the charioteer, reason, takes us and manages a person between these 2 extremes. You can think of it this also in religious terminology, the good angel, the bad angel, the good side of you, the bad side of you, and then reason taking you through what you desire and what is just and right. Okay? And you see the exact same theme, by the way, in Freud in a different shape. What you desire is your id, and the taboos placed on society is your superego, and your ego attempts to mediate between the id and the. So it's basically Plato, just in different terms. Yes?
What is the state?
We're coming to that. First we start with human nature, then we move to the state. So, the fundamental characteristics of a body, of a person, are your head, your chest, and your abdomen. Correct? Right. I forgot the chest in the middle. With each of these physical characteristics, Plato says, is associated a personality kind. Those who have who live their life from their head tend to favor reason. They are the nerds. Those who tend to live their life from their chest, so to speak metaphorically, have will and courage and fortitude. And those जो टेढ़ रहते हैं, they have an appetite, which by the way is also absolutely essential. So we have your people who are your nerds, Essentially, you can take all of lums and divide them into 3 categories. आप अपने लिए भी लिखेंगे आप कौन सी category में? Are you a nerd? Are you a sports jock? You like sports, etc.? Are you good at your studies? Here, sports jock will be here, and you sit around the खोखा and canteen and eat and have a good time. Is here. वो भी ज़रूरी है. From these also come several virtues. Those who think with the head, reason and reason dominates their soul, have wisdom. Those who have the development of will from the chest have courage, and those with appetites who are mainly ted wale log observe temperance. Temperance means ke aaj main nahi khana khaunga. Ye jo bhi. Now you have states that also accord with that, and what role will these people play in any given state? So those who have reason, who are brainy, who have wisdom, ought to be in an ideal state the rulers of that society. Those who have courage and willpower and strength, real physical raw strength, ought to be the soldiers of that particular state, to defend that state. And those who have appetite and undertake temperance and so on, and love the worldly things, etc., essentially, ought to be the laborers, the workers, the artisans, the people who create, and so on. And so for Plato, there ought to be in the ideal state a hierarchy according to your nature. Those with wisdom ought to rule, those with courage ought to defend, those who love the worldly things ought to create those worldly things. There are 3 classes, therefore, in Plato: the guardians, the auxiliaries, and the workers. The guardians are the ruling intelligentsia, drawn from the most capable people from every class, thought Plato. And Plato was feminist enough to think women can be equally part of the guardian class. His academy had many, many women in it as well. They ought to be trained for 35 years, and they must be trained in everything. They must be good sportsmen, they must be good at physics, chemistry, math, music, poetry, the works, all-rounders. That's why they have to be trained so long. They have to have a PhD, basically, in philosophy. And also, and this is very important, they live in a kind of Platonic communism. They should not want for anything. They should not be greedy people. Hence, they should not ideally have any families, no children. Because if they have children and families, and if they have property, then they will work for their children, they will work for their families, they will work to increase their properties. But a true philosopher is somebody who is beyond all of that and can say bye-bye to all of that and lives only for one purpose, and that purpose is the discovery of knowledge and so on, and the spread of that knowledge in society and recreating that society on the basis of knowledge. That's why when Modi says कि मैंने तो सियासत के लिए अपनी और आवाम के लिए अपनी बीवी और बच्चों को छोड़ दिया और अपनी ज़िंदगी छोड़ दी, everybody says that's really Platonic of you, well done. मेरी तो कोई जायदाद भी नहीं, मैं तो चाय बनाता था वगैरह वगैरह. He's making a very Platonic argument, even though he may not realize it. Or when Imran Khan says कि मेरे पास तो सब कुछ है, मुझे तो ये कुछ चाहिए ही नहीं, मुझे कोई हवस नहीं है, इसलिए मैं सियासत में जब आया हूँ मैं किसी हवस के बगैर आया हूँ. Again, he is making a very Platonic argument. He is saying कि जो हवस करते हैं वो अच्छी सियासत नहीं कर सकते. So this Platonic communism exists, and this of course shocked his contemporaries, especially when he said that the guardian class will have no families, and if they have children, then the children will be brought up by the state and not by them personally, etc. And that there will be a community of women and so on, community of wives and children to serve the guardian class. Really was quite shocking for his contemporaries, who thought that that was quite nuts. But nonetheless, this guardian class would be trained along the same lines as the Spartans trained their soldiers. बचपन से लेके 35 साल तक उनको train करते रहेंगे, उनको society से अलग करके. They will be the finest thinkers on the planet. By the way, आपने वो फिल्म तो देखी होगी Guardians of the Galaxy. मगर आपने सुपरमैन देखी थी किसी ज़माने में? सुपरमैन में जो सुपरमैन का जो अब्बा जान होते हैं, he belongs to a council which is called the Guardians. You may not realize it. All of this is basically taken from Plato. that in a future society there will be these babas sitting on these long chairs जिनकी लंबी लंबी टेंड होगी और बड़े बुड्ढे होंगे वो और बस सोचा करेंगे I think you should do this. So, कई आपने साइंस फिक्शन फिल्मों में ये देखा होगा. So they are really taking from Plato, who existed such a long time ago. For women, he said, a state that does not educate and train women is like a wrestler or a man who trains only his right arm. Can a wrestler be कामयाब if you only train your right arm और इधर से बिल्कुल पतली सी बाजू हो? तो क्या मुकाबला करेंगे किसी दूसरे का? And he believed that women should be trained with men, including in physical exercises. And by the way, mostly the Greeks used to train almost completely naked when they went into the gymnasium. Just a fun fact that you ought to know. You know why? Because they would get dirty. And clothes were expensive. And he didn't want clothes to get dirty. And they were allowed to mix freely. They lived communal lives, no home. Children, if they were born to the guardian class, would be taken from women and reared by special nurses appointed by the state. And the state organized children and child rearing. And this would create, he thought, a harmonious republic. The perfect state would exist when the social structure was in harmony with the characteristics of the body, soul, and virtue of the individual. Agar aapne soldiers ko bana diya in charge, they're not thinking people. They think every problem requires to be taken head on, like a soldier would. But some problems require diplomatic solutions, retreat rather than advance. And they're not trained for that mentality. They're trained to destroy an opponent, never to retreat in the face of an opponent. They don't make for very good politicians for that reason. And neither would the laborers make for very good politicians because their function is to create things for the appetite. They want things to grow and develop, and that's not bad. But sometimes the things that they create can be bad. And you need somebody to stop them from creating those things or from creating them in moderate quantities. So you could get, a sort of dictatorship of the soldiers, or you could get a dictatorship of those who just want to create goodies and live a good life and just be happy and a hedonistic sort of lifestyle. If you had any of the other people on top, you've got to have the most intelligent, intellectual people on top. Think about it like this. If you create a football team, don't you want the best footballer to lead your team, the best captain, the person who knows most about football? If you create a cricket team, don't you want the person who knows the most about cricket and organizing a cricket team to lead your cricket team? If you come and take a class in Paul Field, don't you want the person who knows political philosophy to teach you political philosophy? If you're in an aeroplane, do you want anybody to just get up and say, oh, I'm going to drive the aeroplane to London today, I'm going to fly the aeroplane? No, you want a pilot who's good at it, right? Then why is it that when it comes to the most important decisions that any society can take, all the decisions of a society, how it's going to be organized, what the law is, you are ready to select somebody who has no clue, experience, or understanding about politics whatsoever? Oh, now I see why you're packing your books, because you think it's the end of class. It's not. Oh, mera ye laptop hi mar gaya. Acha. Why is it that you take somebody like that? Plato will have none of it. He wants only the most intelligent, the brightest, the sharpest, the most aware people to lead society. And he doesn't care whether therefore he doesn't want what we call democracy, because in a democracy you would have the demos leading society. And the demos is not going to make the right decisions for society. Those decisions have to be taken by people who are skilled and equipped in those things. And we accept that in everything, except in politics. And that's what leads to all the problems in politics, according to Plato. If we have people who have, let's say, for example, a PhD in political science from some of the top universities in the country, in the world, and they've written a book on the class structure of Pakistan, and they happen to teach political philosophy at a really good institution in the country. If you happen to know about somebody like that, then perhaps they would make the ideal candidate to run the country.